The first time she said the words, open marriage, it wasn't a question. It was a verdict delivered over pasta that was already going cold. And the way she said it, calm, rehearsed, almost proud, made my stomach drop harder than if she'd screamed it at me, because I could hear the hidden part underneath, the part she wasn't saying out loud, which was that she'd already stepped through the door and was only turning back to see whether I would follow quietly. She sat across from me with her elbows on the table like we were negotiating a kitchen remodel, twisting the stem of her wine glass between her fingers, her wedding ring catching the light every time her hand moved, and she said, in that gentle voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I don't want us to end up like people who resent each other in silence. So I want us to be honest and mature about what we need." And I remember how she watched my face for a reaction, not with fear, not with guilt, but with the focused curiosity of someone measuring whether the line they're about to cross will hold their weight. I tried to laugh like she was joking, because laughter is a reflex when reality shows up too fast. And I said, "You're serious right now. You're seriously saying this like it's an obvious next step." And she tilted her head as if I'd missed the point, then replied, "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to prevent us from hurting each other, because this is what healthy couples do when they care enough to be honest." And that word healthy landed with a cold sting, because it positioned my discomfort as immaturity and her desire as progress. The air between us felt charged in the worst way, like a storm building in a room with closed windows, and I couldn't stop noticing details that made it more surreal, like the way her hair fell over one shoulder, like the faint scent of her perfume, like the shape of her mouth when she said the word freedom, and the fact that a part of my brain still reacted to her, still tracked her the way you track someone you've loved for years, even as another part of me realized that whatever intimacy we had was being repackaged into an argument I hadn't agreed to. I asked her, carefully, because I could already feel my voice turning brittle, "Is this something you want to talk about? Or is this something you've already decided?" And she didn't answer immediately. She took a sip of wine and looked down at her plate as if arranging her thoughts into the most flattering order. And then she said, "I've decided I don't want to live the rest of my life wondering what I missed because we were following rules we never even chose." And I told her, "We chose them when we stood in front of our families and promised each other something specific." And she leaned back in her chair with a sigh that carried more impatience than sadness, saying, "Promises can evolve when people evolve." And for the first time that night, I felt something sharp rise under my ribs, because she wasn't talking like someone opening a conversation. She was talking like someone pushing a policy change through a meeting where dissent was inconvenient. She started building her case with the kind of certainty that makes you question your own reality, talking about how monogamy was just one model, how people were capable of loving more than one person, how jealousy was a learned response, and the entire time she kept her voice low and soothing, like she was trying to calm a nervous animal. And I realized she had practiced this, maybe in front of a mirror, or maybe with someone else who nodded along and told her she was brave, because she never stumbled, never searched for words, never looked like a person stepping into unknown territory. When I asked the question I didn't want to ask but couldn't avoid, when I said, "Why now? What changed? What happened that made you bring this up tonight?" she held my gaze too steadily and replied, "Nothing happened. I'm just tired of pretending we don't both feel stuck sometimes." And it was such a smooth answer that it felt like a lie polished until it shone. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I remember gripping my fork so hard my knuckles hurt, because the more she spoke, the more I sensed there was a missing person in the room, an invisible third presence she was refusing to name, and that suspicion did something humiliating, because it made me aware of my own desire like a weak spot. She stood up to clear the plates as if this were an ordinary dinner, moving around the kitchen with that familiar confidence that used to feel like home. And when she passed behind me, her hand brushed my shoulder, a casual touch that sent a small spark through my body despite everything. And I hated that spark for existing, because it reminded me how easily she could still pull something out of me while simultaneously negotiating the terms of my replacement. I turned in my chair and said, "Slower now. You're talking about this like it's theoretical, like we're exploring an idea. But you're too calm for that. So tell me the truth, because I can handle a lot more than I can handle being played." And her expression tightened for the first time, just a flicker. Then she recovered and said, "I'm not playing you. I'm trying to include you." And I asked, "Include me in what?" And she replied, "In the next version of us." And the way she said it made me feel like the current version had already been discarded. I remember standing up, following her to the sink and saying, "If you want an open marriage, then say what you mean, because I'm not agreeing to something I don't understand." And she set a plate down with controlled precision before turning to me and saying, "I mean, I want the freedom to explore without it being cheating. And I want you to have that freedom too, because I don't want either of us feeling trapped." And the word cheating hung between us like a dare, because she'd framed it so neatly that refusing made me sound possessive and accepting made me complicit. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt that split inside me widen, the part that remembered the nights she curled against me like I was the only safe place in the world, and the part that saw her now, steady and prepared, offering freedom with one hand while hiding the rest of the story behind her back. And I understood with a sudden, sinking certainty that this was not an invitation to explore. It was permission she wanted stamped and signed. And the moment I realized that, the dinner table stopped feeling like a place where we ate together and started feeling like a courtroom where I hadn't been warned I was on trial. She didn't give me time to process the shock before she started drafting the rules, and the way she did it was almost impressive in a cold, corporate way, like she'd walked into the conversation with a slide deck already prepared and was just waiting for me to stop blinking so she could click to the next screen. She sat back down across from me, tucked her hair behind her ear, and said she'd thought about boundaries because she didn't want this to get messy. And then she listed them with that same calm voice that made everything feel unreal. No emotional involvement, no friends, no co-workers, no public embarrassment, and above all, no overlap with our real life, as if sex could be separated from connection the way you separate laundry colors. And I remember how she said emotional involvement with a tiny frown, like it was the true betrayal, and everything else could be negotiated. I asked her what exactly counted as emotional involvement, because the question mattered more than she wanted to admit, and she responded with a sharp little smile and told me I was overthinking it, that I would know it when it happened, that the point was to keep feelings out of it. And when I said, "So you're asking me to sign on to a set of rules you get to interpret whenever it suits you?" she leaned forward and said, "I'm asking you to trust me, because this only works if we're mature." And that word mature became her shield, because every time I pushed back she swung it between us, as if my discomfort proved I wasn't evolved enough to deserve a say. She added one more rule, almost casually, that she didn't want to hear details, and I watched her eyes as she said it, because there was a flicker there that wasn't confidence, it was calculation, the kind that shows up when someone is trying to control not just behavior, but perception. And I realized she was building a world where she could do whatever she wanted, as long as she didn't have to picture me doing it too. I tried to meet her on the level she claimed we were operating on, the rational level, so I asked questions like a person who still believed honesty might exist in the room, and I said, "If this is about freedom, then why are the boundaries mostly about your comfort? Because you're telling me I can have freedom as long as it doesn't make you feel anything uncomfortable." And she didn't like that, because her expression tightened and she said, "You're twisting it. I'm trying to protect what we have." And I told her, "Protecting what we have would have been talking to me before you reached the point of presenting this like a decision." And she exhaled like she was counting to keep her patience, then said, "I knew you would react like this, which is exactly why people lie, because honesty gets punished." And that line hit me like a slap disguised as philosophy, because she had just reframed my pain as aggression, my questions as punishment, and her proposed betrayal as brave honesty. She walked around the table while she spoke, and I hated that my body still registered her, hated that the familiar shape of her hips and the soft brush of her sweater sleeve as she passed behind me still sparked that old reflex, because it made me feel weak in the exact moment I needed to be clear-eyed. When she stopped at the counter and looked back at me, she said, I'm not asking you to like it. I'm asking you to be realistic, because people cheat when they feel trapped, and I'd rather we do this in the open than end up hating each other. And I said, so the threat is that if I don't agree to this, you'll do it anyway and call it cheating, and if I do agree to it, you'll do it anyway and call it growth. And for the first time, she didn't have a clean answer, because she just stared at me for a beat too long before saying, you always make things sound sinister, which was her way of refusing to admit that what I'd said was accurate. That was the moment the imbalance became undeniable, because as she talked, I kept noticing how every rule was designed to limit the consequences for her and increase the risk for me, since she could break my trust and still keep the moral high ground by claiming it was agreed upon, while I was being asked to swallow my own discomfort so she could feel unburdened. I told her I needed time, and she said time felt like punishment, and I asked her whether she had someone in mind, because a question like this doesn't show up out of nowhere unless there's a face attached to it. And she looked at me with a softness that felt practiced and said, it's not about a specific person, it's about a mindset. And then, almost in the same breath, she added that she'd been reading about it, talking to people, realizing how many couples were happier once they stopped pretending exclusivity was the only way to love. And something about the way she said talking to people made my stomach turn, because it wasn't the casual phrasing of someone exploring an idea. It was the phrasing of someone seeking approval for a choice already made. I nodded outwardly, because in that moment I understood that arguing wasn't going to expose the truth. It was only going to give her more chances to paint me as the obstacle. And as she watched me for a reaction, waiting for me to either break or bless it, I felt a different kind of clarity settle in, quiet and sharp. Because if she wanted rules, I could play within rules better than she thought. And if she wanted an open marriage in name, then I would make sure it was open in reality, not just open in the direction she had already chosen. The name slipped out the way truths always do, dressed up as something casual and harmless, because a few days after that dinner, while we were pretending normalcy hadn't been quietly dismantled, she mentioned she'd grabbed coffee with someone from college, and the way she said it, light and quick, carried the same tone she used when she didn't want a follow-up question, which of course guaranteed one. So I asked who, trying to sound indifferent even as my pulse picked up, and she hesitated just long enough for my instincts to flare before saying the name. A woman I remembered vaguely from old photos and stories, someone who'd existed in the background of her past like a footnote I'd never bothered to read closely. She immediately added, "It was nothing, just catching up," in a way that felt defensive before there was anything to defend, and I felt that familiar, humiliating tightening in my chest, the one that comes when your body knows it's being lied to, a half second before your mind is willing to accept it, because it wasn't the name itself that mattered. It was the way her eyes flicked away after she said it, the way she smoothed the front of her shirt like she was erasing fingerprints, the way she changed the subject with a practiced pivot that made it clear this conversation was not meant to linger. I let it go outwardly, because I was already learning that pushing too hard only made her retreat into that language of maturity and boundaries. But inside, something settled into place, because that name reframed the entire open marriage conversation in a way that made my stomach drop, turning it from an abstract philosophy lesson into something retroactive, something designed to legitimize a desire that already had a destination. Over the next few days, the pattern sharpened until it was impossible to ignore, because that name came up again in passing, always followed by a quick dismissal, always delivered with the same forced nonchalance, and I started noticing the small shifts in her behavior that lined up too neatly to be coincidence, the way she checked her phone more often when we were together, the way she dressed with just a little more intention before running errands, the way she seemed oddly energized after these supposed catch-ups, and it all fed into a realization that sat heavy and cold in my gut, which was that the open marriage wasn't a door she wanted to open together. It was a door she'd already opened on her own, and was now inviting me to step through so she wouldn't have to feel like she'd crossed a line alone. One evening, when we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch pretending to watch something neither of us was actually following, I asked her, carefully and without accusation, how often she'd been talking to this friend, and she laughed softly and said I was reading into things, that reconnecting with people from your past didn't automatically mean something inappropriate. And then she added, almost as an afterthought, "This is exactly why I brought up the open marriage, because I don't want every interaction to feel like it needs defending." And that was the moment I understood how neatly she'd arranged it, how the proposal itself had become a shield, because any discomfort I expressed could now be framed as evidence that we needed it. There was a strange, bitter intimacy in that realization, because it forced me to see her not as someone confused or impulsive, but as someone who had already decided on an outcome and was now managing the narrative to get there with minimal resistance. That night, lying next to her while she scrolled on her phone with the screen angled away from me, I felt the full weight of how uneven the ground beneath us had become, because part of me still wanted her, still tracked the familiar lines of her body in the dim light, still responded to the sound of her breathing the way it always had, and that desire felt like a liability now, something she could exploit simply by existing, while another part of me was pulling back, cataloging details, drawing quiet conclusions she didn't realize I was making. The next morning, when she mentioned that same friend again, this time with a casual comment about how easy it was to talk to her, something in my expression must have shifted because she paused and said, "You're not jealous, are you?" with a small, knowing smile, and I answered honestly in a way that surprised even me, telling her I wasn't jealous so much as attentive, that I was trying to understand what she was actually asking for instead of what she was calling it. And the flash of irritation that crossed her face told me I'd hit closer to the truth than she wanted. She told me I was overanalyzing again, that I needed to stop assigning meaning to names and conversations, and I nodded, because arguing about it in that moment would have only given her another opportunity to dismiss me. But inside, the picture had already come into focus, sharp and undeniable, because once you recognize the tone someone uses when they're already committed to a choice, you can't unhear it. And every time she said that name after that, it sounded less like a coincidence and more like a breadcrumb trail she assumed I was too distracted, too trusting, or too desperate to follow. I didn't announce my decision or dramatize it, because the choice I made was quiet and deliberate, the kind that settles in your chest and changes the way you move through a room before anyone else notices. And it started the morning I realized that if she wanted an open marriage defined by rules she controlled, then the only power I had was to take those rules seriously instead of emotionally. I told her I'd thought about what she said, that I understood her point about freedom and honesty, and the relief that flashed across her face in that moment was almost insulting, because it confirmed she'd been bracing for resistance rather than reflection, and she squeezed my hand like we'd just crossed a difficult but necessary bridge together. I played my part carefully after that, asking clarifying questions in a neutral tone, agreeing to the boundaries she'd outlined, repeating her own language back to her so she could hear how reasonable it sounded coming from someone else, and the more cooperative I appeared, the less guarded she became, because she mistook my calm for compliance instead of calculation. A few days later, when she mentioned she'd be busy one evening, I said I might make plans too, watching her closely as I did, and the flicker of something like surprise that crossed her face before she smiled told me she hadn't really imagined me doing that. Not in a concrete way, not with an actual person attached, and that small moment of imbalance was enough to confirm I was on the right path. Reaching out to her college friend didn't feel like revenge in the dramatic sense. It felt like stepping into a current that had already been flowing beneath the surface, because I remembered meeting her years ago at a reunion, remembered the easy way she spoke, the warmth that didn't demand anything from you, and when I found her profile and sent a message that was careful and unassuming, framed as catching up rather than anything loaded, she responded quickly in a way that felt open rather than cautious. We met for coffee in the middle of the afternoon, neutral territory that didn't feel like crossing a line, even as it clearly was one. And when she walked in and smiled at me with recognition that softened into curiosity, I felt that low hum of attraction spark to life, not explosive or overwhelming, but steady and undeniable, the kind that grows when someone looks at you like you're present instead of inconvenient. We talked about ordinary things at first, work, time, how strange it feels when life doesn't turn out the way you pictured in your 20s, and there was an ease to it that caught me off guard, because I hadn't realized how much effort I'd been putting into every interaction at home until it was no longer required. As the conversation stretched, the tension shifted subtly, glances lasting a beat longer than necessary, the space between us feeling charged in a way that wasn't explicit but was unmistakable. And when she asked, gently, how my marriage was going, I answered honestly without oversharing, telling her we were navigating some changes, and the way she nodded, like she understood more than I'd said, sent a strange thrill through me that was part validation and part danger. I didn't touch her, didn't lean in too close, didn't say anything I couldn't justify under the rules my wife had insisted on, but I walked away from that meeting with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks, because for the first time since the open marriage conversation, I wasn't reacting to my wife's choices. I was making my own within the framework she'd created. That night, when I told my wife I'd met a friend for coffee, she smiled and said she was glad I was embracing the idea, and the irony of her approval sat heavy in my chest, because she had no idea how intentional my calm had become, how every agreeable nod was layered over a decision she couldn't see yet. Lying in bed later, listening to her breathe, I felt the shift fully settle, the moment where confusion gave way to direction, because I wasn't chasing balance or fairness anymore. I was following the logic of the situation to its natural conclusion, and if she wanted an open marriage that protected her comfort above all else, then I would live inside that truth completely, even if it led somewhere she hadn't planned for, because the most powerful move I had left wasn't to argue or protest. It was to take her at her word and see how she handled the reality she'd been so eager to design. She told me the truth on the third time we met, not dramatically and not all at once, but in that careful, measured way people use when they're deciding whether you're strong enough to hold what they're about to hand you. And we were sitting in her car this time because the cafe had grown too loud and too public, rain tapping against the windshield in a steady rhythm that made the world outside feel distant. And after a pause that stretched just long enough to make my chest tighten, she said, "There's something I should tell you before this goes any further, because I don't want to pretend I don't already know more than I probably should." And the way she looked at me then wasn't flirtatious or apologetic, but serious in a way that instantly shifted the air between us. I asked her what she meant, keeping my voice steady even as my pulse picked up, and she exhaled slowly before explaining that my wife had reached out to her weeks earlier, long before that dinner conversation I'd replayed 100 times in my head, presenting the open marriage as a mutual decision already made, describing me as distant, checked out, emotionally unavailable in a way that made the whole thing sound like a humane transition instead of a unilateral move. And as she spoke, I felt that familiar cold spread through my stomach, not because of jealousy, but because of recognition, because this was the missing piece that made everything click into place. She told me my wife had framed it as concern, saying she didn't want to blindside me, that she wanted everyone involved to be respectful, that she was trying to avoid unnecessary pain, and the cruelty of that phrasing lodged itself deep, because it meant the narrative had been curated carefully, with me reduced to a concept rather than a person. And when I asked, quietly, why she'd agreed to meet me at all if she believed that version, she said she hadn't fully believed it, that something about the way my wife spoke felt off, too controlled, too rehearsed, and that curiosity had turned into discomfort. The more details didn't line up. She admitted she'd expected to meet someone closed off and resentful, and instead she'd found someone attentive and present, someone who listened without angling for sympathy, and the honesty of that admission created a strange, intimate tension between us, because it wasn't just about attraction anymore. It was about shared clarity, about two people realizing they'd been placed into a story without their consent. I sat there absorbing it all, the rain blurring the city lights outside, the realization settling heavy and precise, because this wasn't an open marriage that had gone wrong. It was a cover story that had been rolled out after the fact. And when I finally spoke, I said, "So she was laying the groundwork before she ever spoke to me." And the friend nodded, telling me my wife had asked questions about boundaries and comfort levels, as if she were conducting research, as if she were assembling a plan that would feel ethical once everyone else accepted the framing. There was a moment of charged silence after that, the kind where everything unsaid presses close, and I became acutely aware of how near we were to each other, how the honesty between us had stripped away pretense and left something raw and electric in its place. And when she reached out and touched my arm lightly, not in a way that crossed a line, but in a way that grounded me, I felt a surge of conflicting emotion that was equal parts desire and resolve. She told me she hadn't intended to be part of anything deceptive, that she'd only agreed to meet my wife because she believed it was already settled, and that seeing me now, hearing my version without embellishment, made it impossible for her to pretend this was all harmless. And I thanked her for telling me even though the words felt inadequate, because what she'd given me wasn't just information. It was confirmation that my instincts hadn't betrayed me. When I drove home later that night, the house felt different, quieter, but sharper. And when my wife asked casually how my evening had been, smiling like everything was proceeding according to plan, I realized with unsettling calm that I was now several steps ahead of her, because while she believed she was managing outcomes, I was finally seeing the full shape of what she'd done, and that knowledge carried a steady, dangerous satisfaction, the kind that doesn't rush or shout but waits patiently, knowing that once the truth is fully visible, it has a way of rearranging everything without asking permission. The boundaries started collapsing in ways that felt almost polite at first, like a door left ajar instead of kicked in, because nothing dramatic happened to mark the shift, only a gradual erosion of the careful distance we'd both been pretending to maintain. And it began the night we met for dinner instead of coffee, choosing a place dim enough to feel private but public enough to pretend we were still being careful. We talked longer than planned, the conversation drifting from safe topics into more personal territory without either of us steering it there. And I noticed how easily she laughed, how she held my gaze when I spoke, how different it felt to be listened to without having my words weighed for inconvenience, and that difference carried its own quiet intimacy. When she told me about her own failed relationship, about how being treated like an accessory instead of a partner had hollowed something out in her, I felt an almost physical pull toward her, not just attraction but recognition, and the irony of it hit me hard, because this was exactly the kind of emotional overlap my wife had warned against while insisting it wouldn't happen. And yet here it was, unfolding naturally in the absence of manipulation. We didn't touch, but the space between us felt charged enough that I was acutely aware of every movement, every shift of her knee under the table, every pause that lingered just a beat too long, and when we finally stood to leave, the moment stretched in a way that made my chest tighten, because walking away felt like an act of restraint rather than neutrality. At home, my wife seemed lighter, almost buoyant, mistaking my calm for comfort, and she talked freely about her own plans, dropping hints without detail, assuming I wouldn't ask because I hadn't before. And I watched her with a strange detachment as she moved through the house, noticing how little curiosity she had about my internal life now that she believed it had been neutralized. When I mentioned, casually, that I'd had dinner with her college friend again, she smiled and said she was glad I was using the freedom constructively, and the phrasing struck me, because it revealed how transactional she'd made the whole thing, how she believed emotional distance could be managed like a budget as long as nobody overspent. Later that night, lying beside her while she scrolled through her phone, I realized how little I wanted her to touch me, not out of spite, but because the connection I'd felt earlier lingered in a way that made this closeness feel performative, and that realization carried a sharp clarity with it, because desire, once redirected, doesn't respond well to obligation. The next day, when the college friend texted to ask if I wanted to go for a walk, I hesitated only long enough to acknowledge the line I was about to cross, then accepted, understanding that pretending the line wasn't already fading would be the real dishonesty. The walk stretched into hours, conversation looping back on itself in that easy way that signals comfort rather than novelty, and at one point we stopped near the water. The city noise muted just enough to make the quiet between us feel intentional, and she turned to me and said, "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" And the way she said it wasn't accusatory or suggestive, it was reflective, as if she were naming something that had already happened. I told her the truth, that I'd agreed to an open marriage thinking I was consenting to an idea, not a rewrite of my own relevance, and she listened without interrupting, her expression open and steady, and when she said, "You deserve to be chosen without conditions," something inside me shifted decisively, because it articulated a need I'd been compressing for too long. The moment didn't end with a kiss or a declaration. It ended with us standing closer than before, close enough to feel the warmth of each other, close enough that restraint became a choice rather than an absence of opportunity. And when we finally stepped apart, the air between us felt heavier, not with guilt, but with inevitability. Driving home afterward, I understood that the rules my wife had set were already failing under the weight of reality, because you can't ask for honesty and then be surprised when it creates connection. And as I pulled into the driveway and saw the familiar outline of my house, I felt a calm certainty settle in, because whatever came next would not be about breaking boundaries. It would be about acknowledging that they had been designed to fail in the first place, and that once you stop pretending otherwise, the truth has a way of moving forward whether anyone is ready for it or not. The second truth didn't arrive with shock so much as a sickening sense of confirmation, because by the time I uncovered it, part of me had already adjusted to the idea that the open marriage had never been what it claimed to be, and the confirmation came from a place so mundane it almost felt insulting. A shared account statement left open on her laptop while she was in the shower. Numbers I hadn't scrutinized before because I'd trusted the story attached to them. I wasn't looking for evidence when I noticed the irregularity, because suspicion had stopped feeling urgent and started feeling procedural. But once I saw the pattern, it was impossible to unsee. Small charges clustered around dates she'd been vague about, hotels billed as work-related travel, meals paid for in parts of town she never had a reason to be in alone, and the realization settled slowly and painfully that she hadn't been waiting for permission to explore. She'd been trying to sanitize a timeline that was already dirty. I confronted her that night not with accusation but with quiet precision, asking her to help me understand why expenses tied to her reconnection period predated the open marriage conversation, and the way she froze, just for a second too long, told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. She tried first to deflect, saying I was misinterpreting things, then to minimize, saying she hadn't planned for it to go anywhere serious, and finally, when those didn't land, she shifted to anger, accusing me of digging through things I had no right to question now that we'd agreed to openness. And it was in that escalation that the truth slipped out fully formed, because she snapped that she hadn't wanted to hurt me by telling me sooner, that bringing up the open marriage had been her way of being fair once she realized she wanted more, and the room went very still as the meaning of that sentence finished assembling itself in my head. I told her, evenly, that fairness doesn't work retroactively, that consent doesn't apply to things already done, and she shot back that it wasn't cheating if she'd already decided we were changing the rules, and hearing that made something in me go cold, because it revealed the final shape of what she'd been doing, which wasn't exploring or evolving, but rewriting, changing definitions after the fact, so she could keep the image of herself she preferred intact. She paced while she talked, hands moving as if arranging invisible pieces into a version of events she could live with, explaining how trapped she'd felt, how lonely, how the connection had started before she could stop it, and I watched her with a strange calm as she described months of decisions as if they were weather patterns, unavoidable and impersonal, and when I asked why she'd contacted her college friend before ever speaking to me, she admitted she'd wanted to see if there was something there before blowing up her life, and that admission landed harder than anything else, because it meant the open marriage wasn't an act of honesty, but a contingency plan, a way to step from one certainty into another without ever standing alone. The argument burned itself out not with resolution but with exhaustion, and when she finally fell silent, waiting for me to respond with either forgiveness or fury, I realized how little either of those options appealed to me, because they both required me to center her feelings again, to react on terms she set. I told her I needed space, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, and she scoffed, asking what that even meant in an open marriage, and I answered that it meant I was no longer interested in pretending this had been mutual, that I had agreed to a concept she'd already violated, and that whatever we were now couldn't be held together by language alone. She accused me of punishing her for being honest, and I replied that honesty after the fact isn't honesty. It's damage control. And the look on her face then wasn't rage or heartbreak, but something closer to fear, because for the first time she understood that the narrative she'd built might not survive contact with my clarity. I left the house that night and drove without direction until the city thinned out, my phone lighting up with messages I didn't read. And in that quiet, I felt a strange sense of relief, because the second twist of the knife had also been the final one, cutting through the last illusion I'd been maintaining, which was that this had ever been about freedom or growth. By the time I pulled over and sat with the engine off, the truth felt settled and complete, and with it came a calm resolve, because once you realize you were never being invited to choose, only to approve, the question of what comes next stops being emotional and starts being structural, and I knew then that whatever ending awaited us would not be dictated by the story she wanted to tell, but by the reality she could no longer avoid. The confrontation happened in the one place she thought she still had control, our living room, because she invited me to sit down like this was going to be a negotiation instead of a reckoning, her posture calm, her voice already softened into that tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, and she started by saying she could tell something had shifted in me, that I seemed distant, guarded, that she was worried we were losing alignment. And I almost laughed at the phrasing because it revealed how deeply she still believed this was a management issue rather than the consequence of months of deception. She expected anger, expected raised voices or accusations she could deflect or soothe. And when I didn't give her any of that, when I simply sat there and waited, she filled the silence by explaining herself again, reframing the open marriage as a brave attempt to save us, insisting that mistakes had been made on both sides, that we were both responsible for letting things drift. And when she said, "I thought you understood that this was about honesty," I finally spoke, not loudly and not emotionally, but with a clarity that made her pause mid-sentence, because I told her that honesty doesn't begin after you've already made choices in secret, that consent doesn't apply to past actions, and that calling something mutual doesn't make it so when one person is being informed after the fact. She bristled at that, her composure cracking as she accused me of holding on to details instead of focusing on the bigger picture, and I told her calmly that the bigger picture was exactly the problem, because it showed a pattern of decisions she'd made alone and then wrapped in language designed to make me complicit. She tried a different tactic then, leaning into vulnerability, telling me she'd been scared, that she hadn't known how to talk to me, that she'd convinced herself this was the least harmful way forward. And as she spoke, I watched how carefully she curated her emotions, how even her tears seemed to arrive on schedule, and I realized that what unsettled her most wasn't the possibility of losing me, but the possibility of losing the story she told herself about being a good person. When I told her I knew she'd contacted her college friend before ever speaking to me, the room went very still, and she asked how I knew with a sharpness that betrayed her fear. And I answered simply that the truth has a way of surfacing when you stop controlling it, and she snapped that it didn't matter anymore, that everything was out in the open now, and I said that was exactly the problem, because what she called openness was actually damage control, and the reason this conversation wasn't going the way she expected was because I wasn't here to negotiate my own erasure. She raised her voice then, accusing me of punishing her by being cold, by refusing to reassure her, and I told her that calm isn't punishment. It's what happens when you stop trying to fix something that was broken without your consent. And the look on her face shifted from anger to something closer to panic, because she realized she couldn't steer this anymore. She asked me directly what I wanted, and that was the moment she expected to regain ground, because she assumed I would ask for rules, apologies, reassurance, something that would pull us back into the familiar pattern of discussion and compromise, and instead I told her that I wanted the truth acknowledged as it was, not reframed, not softened, not shared equally, and that if she couldn't do that, then there was nothing left to discuss. She said I was being unfair, that relationships are complicated, that no one is innocent, and I replied that complexity doesn't excuse manipulation, that growth doesn't begin with deception, and that the reason this felt so destabilizing to her was because she'd built her plan on the assumption that I would either comply or explode, never that I would disengage. The argument didn't end with a dramatic exit or a final declaration. It ended with a long silence where she realized I wasn't going to chase her narrative anymore. And when she finally stood up and said she needed air, walking out with the expectation that I would follow, I stayed where I was, listening to the door close, understanding with a steady certainty that this was the moment her control over the story ended, not because I'd won an argument, but because I'd refused to participate in one designed to make me smaller. The fallout didn't announce itself with one catastrophic moment. It spread outward like a slow leak that eventually soaked everything it touched, and I felt it first in the way conversations stopped landing, because after that confrontation she kept trying to interact with me as if nothing irreversible had happened, making small talk, asking logistical questions, testing whether the old rhythm would resume if she acted normal enough, and each time I responded politely but without warmth. I could see the unease growing behind her eyes. She started staying out later again, not with excitement this time, but with restlessness, as if movement itself might delay the reckoning. And when she came home, she watched me closely, gauging whether I was angry or sad or preparing to leave. And the truth was more unsettling than any of those options, because I was simply done negotiating reality with her. Friends began reaching out in fragmented ways, messages that felt cautious and indirect, asking how we were doing, mentioning things they'd heard in passing, and I realized the narrative she'd relied on was beginning to fracture under its own contradictions. Because once you open the door to honesty, people start comparing notes. The college friend stepped back during this time, not dramatically, just respectfully, making it clear she didn't want to be used as leverage or a symbol, and that restraint only sharpened the contrast between genuine connection and the chaos unfolding at home. My wife oscillated between defensiveness and panic, sometimes insisting we could still work through this if I would just stop punishing her with distance, other times accusing me of emotionally abandoning her now that she needed support, and each accusation revealed the same assumption underneath, that I existed to absorb the consequences of her choices while she decided how to feel about them. The marriage didn't end because of jealousy or competition. It ended because the scaffolding holding it up had been removed, and once the truth was fully exposed, there was nothing left to stabilize it, because trust isn't something you rebuild by redefining words, and every attempt she made to frame this as mutual collapse fell flat against the reality of unilateral decisions. We tried, briefly, to discuss next steps in a practical sense: finances, living arrangements, timelines, and even those conversations carried the residue of everything that had happened, because she kept circling back to emotional validation, asking whether I understood why she'd done it, whether I could at least acknowledge her intentions. And I told her, calmly and consistently, that intentions don't erase impact, and that I wasn't interested in co-authoring a version of events that required me to minimize my own experience. That refusal did more to unravel her than any argument ever had, because it left her without an audience willing to affirm her self-concept, and as weeks passed, the cracks widened, friends taking sides quietly, invitations changing, conversations growing awkward, and the open marriage she'd imagined as a sophisticated solution revealing itself as the catalyst that exposed how little foundation we'd actually had left. What surprised me most was how quickly my own life began to reorganize itself once the pretense was gone, because without the constant background noise of managing her expectations, my days felt clearer, decisions simpler, and even grief took on a cleaner shape, less chaotic and more contained. The house grew quieter, then emptier, as she spent more nights elsewhere, and when she finally told me she was moving out for space, the words felt almost redundant, because the emotional distance had already done that work. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final speech, just the sound of drawers opening and closing, the weight of years condensed into boxes, and as I watched her carry things to the car, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief that didn't cancel each other out, because endings don't have to be clean to be final. The fallout touched everything: friendships, routines, assumptions, but it also clarified something essential, which was that the marriage hadn't collapsed because it was opened. It had been opened because it was already collapsing, and once that truth was visible, there was no version of going back that didn't require pretending, and I was done pretending, even if it meant standing alone for a while in the quiet that followed. What remained after everything finally settled wasn't triumph or devastation in the way people like to package endings. It was a strange, steady quiet that crept in once there was no one left trying to convince me that what happened hadn't happened. And I noticed it the first morning I woke up alone in the house without feeling the urge to replay old conversations or rehearse things I wished I'd said differently. The absence felt clean rather than hollow, like a room that's been cleared of furniture you never liked but kept because it came with the place, and I moved through my days with a calm I hadn't felt in years, not because I was healed or enlightened, but because I was no longer spending energy negotiating my own reality. She reached out a few times in the weeks that followed, messages carefully worded to sound reflective and generous, talking about growth and lessons, and how she hoped we could eventually look back without resentment. And each time I read them, I felt the same mild, distant sadness, not for the loss of the marriage itself, but for how committed she still was to smoothing over consequences with language. And I never replied, not out of cruelty, but because silence was the only response that didn't pull me back into a story I'd already stepped out of. The college friend faded naturally from my life too, not with drama or promises, just with an unspoken understanding that what connected us had served its purpose. And when we did speak briefly one last time, there was no regret in her voice, only gratitude for honesty, and that felt right, because neither of us had been looking to replace one illusion with another. As time passed, people stopped asking for updates, stopped treating me like a developing situation, and I felt myself become just a person again instead of a cautionary tale or a conversation topic. And in that ordinariness, there was a deep satisfaction that surprised me, because it meant the story no longer needed an audience to feel complete. I started making plans without checking them against anyone else's expectations, choosing where to go, what to prioritize, who to let close, and each small decision reinforced the same truth, which was that agreeing to the open marriage hadn't cost me my marriage, it had exposed it, stripping away the last layer of polite denial that had been holding everything together. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, a song, a phrase, the way light hit a wall at a certain time of day, and those moments still carried weight, but they no longer carried power, because they were anchored to something finished rather than something unresolved. Standing alone one evening, looking out at a city that felt suddenly full of possibility instead of threat, I understood that the revenge everyone expects in stories like this isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet and structural. It's the refusal to keep carrying someone else's lie once you see it clearly, and the satisfaction doesn't come from watching someone fall apart. It comes from watching yourself stop bending. I didn't walk away with everything I'd hoped for when I got married, but I walked away with something more durable, which was authorship over my own life, the ability to trust my instincts again, and the knowledge that clarity, once earned, doesn't need to announce itself to be real. The open marriage she wanted had been designed to protect her from discomfort, but what it actually did was give me the space to see the full shape of the truth and choose myself without apology. And as I closed the door on that chapter for the last time, I felt neither bitterness nor triumph, only a steady sense of alignment, because for the first time in a long while, my actions and my understanding of myself were finally pointing in the same direction, and that quiet consistency felt like the most honest ending I could have hoped for.